there any questions before I continue? So we were talking about the effects of chronic cortisol on the body, and I talked about the systemic effects, right? So high blood pressure, vasoconstriction, the sodium retention, those are all related. Immune system, blood sugar, bone density, all these systemic effects. There are others. I didn't put them all. It's not an exhaustive list. And then I talked about the neurocognitive effects, right? Memory, decreased attention span, decreased learning capacity, lower verbal skills, poor social skills, aggressiveness, impulsiveness, anxiety, dissociation, depression, decreased pain sensitivity. So, I mean, if you look at all this, if you think about the behavioral profile that you might see in a child who has come from an abusive home, these are the kind of characteristics you're going to see in that child, right? Even if they were not being directly abused themselves, just being in a high stress environment, a chronically elevated level of cortisol in that child. It's not just something they can just get over, like at the drop of a hat. Why can't you just sit down and pay attention? That kind of thing. They are dealing with the chronic effects of stress that have real neuromorphologic, neurocognitive, functional changes to their developing brains, right? So learning how to create a safe, nurturing, comforting environment for those young minds is crucial to learning. This is what I have tried to do in this class. I've really tried to do, because I want you students to grow as much as you can. I don't want aggressive students. I want students who can express themselves articulately. I want you to be able to learn. I want to help you recognize that in yourselves, but also in the broader world, the importance of this. This is like a dramatically underappreciated aspect of low-level chronic stress and the social impact, the societal impact of this. It doesn't even have to be in, I talk about extreme cases where someone's coming from an emotionally abusive or physically abusive household, but just the raised level of cortisol that our society puts on us in so many situations. It's really destructive and counterproductive. So here's a little bit of data. And this is not just, so when I was thinking about, putting up some evidence for this, a lot of the work, I hope you've seen this throughout the semester, when I try to make a correlation, I try to go to the primary literature. I don't just go to mindfulness.net, and pull down some garbage that is up there. I try to support it with rigorously vetted, peer-reviewed science, right? Because that's how you know that what you're looking at is legitimate. But the thing is, I couldn't pull out a single paper that was better than all the rest to show meditation is good at lowering stress. But because there's so many, and in fact, what I was able to find was this meta-analysis. Do you guys know what a meta-analysis is? Who doesn't understand what a meta-analysis is? Okay, a meta-analysis is an analysis, it's a paper where they don't do any of the primary research themselves. What they're doing is they're stepping outside and looking at how research was done from this intermediate level, all right? So a meta-analysis is looking at the literature itself and the studies that have been out there and trying to apply an analytical approach to evaluating that literature. So, it's different than just the background that you might see in a typical paper where they're going to survey the literature or whatever. That's not exhaustive, and it's not explicitly analytic, where they're applying some sort of methodological tools to pulling out and applying criteria to those papers. Does that make sense? So anyways, this meta-analysis, they went through a ton, they went through the whole literature, and they pulled down, there's a bunch of criteria that I'm not going to go through, but they pulled down hundreds of papers and then began to filter them out, and eventually got to 45 studies that met their criteria for a rigorously controlled and constructed study. So maybe a study didn't have the proper controls, they determined, and so that would be eliminated from their meta-analysis. They found 45 studies that met their methodological criteria for inclusion. That's quite a few studies right there. So they're saying these are 45 airtight designed studies where the design is airtight. The analysis showed that meditation compared to some sort of an active control group that was doing maybe just relaxation or reading a book or getting some exercise, it is associated. So meditation is associated compared to those other types of active control with reduced physiological markers of stress across a range of different markers, certainly one of them being cortisol. All right. So, some of the other ones were reduced activation of the sympathetic nervous system. We haven't had a chance to talk about the sympathetic nervous system that much. I'm going to touch on it a little bit in a couple slides, but I'm going to save a deep dive later. Blood pressure, cortisol, heart rate, a host of pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-6. I think I've talked about interleukin-6 maybe a little bit. We'll talk about it some more later. All right, so let's look at this. So here is an example. Mind-body techniques lower circulating markers of stress and inflammation in patients with chronic inflammatory diseases and in obesity. So they have age, BMI, pulse rate, blood pressure, and they separated it from male, total number of subjects. So this is just a way to get a snapshot of the subjects in this study. And here is the result. So the mindfulness and yoga intervention reduced these various stress markers in as early as 10 days in patients with various chronic. So here's day 0. They did 10 days of meditation, and here's 10 day how these. So this is plasma cortisol here, and this is plasma tissue necrosis factor, TNF alpha. So that's a pro-inflammatory marker, and cortisol, stress marker. So just doing 10 days of meditation was able to bring down the baseline circulating plasma levels of these stress markers and inflammatory markers in males and in females. Males, pretty dramatic reductions in pro-inflammatory molecules, across both genders. All right. So what is stress? What is stress? And what is this broader mechanism? We've talked about the HPA axis a little bit. It's part of what's called the general adaptation syndrome. This is the name that was given to it as it was first described by this guy here, Hans Seal. He was an Austro-Hungarian guy that died back in the 80s. He's an interesting character. He was an endocrinologist that put this first pathway together, but he was also found to be guilty of racketeering with R.J. Reynolds' tobacco company. They had hired him to study the effects of stress and the effects of cortisol in the body and show that cigarettes don't cause stress. Cigarettes don't elevate your cortisol. So his research was being funded by them. He elucidated this pathway and then basically colluded with the tobacco industry to provide false findings. Bad people can make good science, I guess. I don't know. You're talking about the protection industry. Yeah, I don't know. I think racketeering is it's where there's collusion. It's a collusion. That's the way I understand it. Anyways, 1936, he said the body is going to respond to an external stimulus or stress with a predictable biological pattern that's going to help the body attempt to overcome that stress and restore the homeostasis. All right, so this was the first finding about 80 years ago that this guy came to. And what does it look like now? Well, there's different phases to this. There is the alarm phase. This is the fight or flight phase. This is short-term stress response. And so what we're going to look at here on this graph, as this graph grows, this is your stress resistance. So if it's up high, you're resistant to that stress. Whatever the stressor is, your body is prepared to deal with it. So time comes on, a stressful event happens, and it impacts you, right? You're prone to that stress. But, and so what happens then? We get the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight autonomic nervous system turns on and sends basic sympathetic signals out to the sympathetic nervous system, which we haven't talked about fully yet. But some of those fibers are going to go right to the suprarenal medulla. And the suprarenal medulla is going to make epinephrine, which many of you maybe are more familiar with as adrenaline. We call it epinephrine now. And norepinephrine is another hormone, mineralocorticoid from the suprarenal medulla. What does this affect? What does this do? So it's going to increase your heart rate. We all know, we've all experienced adrenaline before. I imagine anybody who's, I don't know, ridden a bike for the first time or, you know, had their first kiss or gone skateboarding or anything like that, you know, adrenaline turns on. So increased heart rate, blood pressure goes up, your blood sugar goes up, the liver starts mobilizing, the glycogen, which is a form of starch, animal starch, that is in the liver that gets mobilized when you need glucose. Bronchodilation, that means the bronchioles, the tubes that go into the bronchial tree, into your lungs, they get bigger so you can take oxygen in more easily. You have blood flow changes that are going to increase your alertness, slow down your digestion, and reduce the amount of urine produced. And it's going to just basically ramp up the metabolism. Okay, so that brings us into this resistance phase. So all these things happen. We're getting the mineral corticoids, the glucocorticoids coming out of the suprarenal medulla. The sympathetic nervous system is turning on growth hormone. The pituitary sympathetic stimulation still coming down, getting the kidney involved. That's going to affect blood pressure, but osmolyte concentrations in the blood, like how much water and sodium you're retaining. All of this stuff starts happening, and we go into this phase where our ability to resist stress is pretty high. We hit a high plateau, all right? But it has a few drawbacks. It leads to immune suppression. Your immune system starts to get suppressed. and we begin to burn fat and protein. That might sound like a good idea, but burning protein is quite a bad idea, and it's not the way you want to be burning fat either. But blood sugar goes up. So all of this is about energy mobilization, right? We're fighting or we're flighting or we're doing something. We're freaking out. So we need more energy. So that's this part of it. And then the rest of this is keeping the sodium and the other osmolytes on board so that we're not excreting them, so we can use them if we need them, right? It's conserving the ions that we might need, the electrolytes that we might need for whatever kind of flight situation. And then finally, there's the exhaustion phase. So at this point, we are in adrenal collapse. All right, your suprarenal medulla, the cortex, are just burnt out. They have been working overtime, and there's a collapse of these vital systems. So we can. This might be a result of depletion of lipid reserves, and it can also lead to cumulative structural changes in various vital organs in the body. And there's a lot of problems associated. We get in a downward spiral in terms of our ability to resist stress. So what does this look like? What does this look like? We'll put a face on it here, a little emoji face. So there's the first part here, right? That first bump that we all get in adrenaline and that first blast of cortisol. So we have high cortisol, high neurotransmitter production, right? And what do they call this? The supernova diva, soon to burn out, right? We've all kind of been there before, right? Everybody feels so great on adrenaline, like they're shining in the room, but it's actually not very good for you. You have really high cortisol levels, all right? It's okay for the time being, but it eventually becomes this wired and tired. You have high cortisol, but neurotransmitter production in the brain starts to go down because of exposure to all this cortisol. So what are some of the physiological outcomes? This leads to infection. This can lead to allergy, because allergy is a manifestation of a dysfunctioning immune system. So we had said, you saw earlier in that resistance phase, that one of the consequences is impacts on the immune system. We certainly will spend at least one lecture talking about the immune system later towards the end of the semester. And then this wired and tired, this is kind of a flip thing. So we have the cortisol is beginning to fully burn out, relieving pressure on the neurotransmitters, but neurotransmitter production is leading to the kind of affect that we have here: inflamed and in pain, the angry. All right, I'm tired, I'm stressed, and I'm pissed. That kind of thing, right? Like, I mean, we've probably all seen it. Hopefully, not experienced it too much, but maybe we've all experienced it. And then finally, this is like the path to perdition here. You eventually end up with low cortisol, low neurotransmitter production, and this is depression, anxiety, and withdrawal. So these are the phases of adrenal overload, collapse. All right. So to sort of wrap up this talk about stress, the systems that are going to respond to stress are the nervous system, and I've talked about that a little bit. The endocrine system, we talked about it just a little bit in terms of the HPA axis, and then the immune system. We haven't really talked about that much at all, but we will. And you'll see that these systems all overlap with one another. They all overlap with one another. So that our ability to mitigate stress through mindful activity, be it yoga or meditation or etc., is going to affect all three of these in a variety of ways. They're all interconnected. And so I'm going to keep bringing us back to this little scheme throughout the rest of the semester to help focus our minds on the interconnected ways that these three systems are going to respond to stress and then respond to meditation and yoga. All right. So let's bring it back to this list that we were working our way down. I put all these these on here before, the effects of meditation on the brain, right? And this last, the first one here that we talked about was the effects of meditation on the gray matter volume in the brain. That's what led us into this discussion of stress and the HPA axis. The next thing on this list, you may notice that I switched some of these around. But next thing we're going to talk about is enhanced connectivity between brain regions. That's where I want to dive in. This PowerPoint is on the Moodle now. It's been updated. And this is going to lead us, this idea of increasing connectivity between the brain as a function of meditation. It's going to lead us into a discussion of this important network in the brain, a highly connected sequence of brain regions called the default mode network. We're calling it the me center of the brain. But we'll get to that in a bit. First, let's talk about enhanced connectivity between brain regions. So, how does the brain work? How does it work? That question will probably never be fully untangled in our lifetime, but we have staggering advances that have been made in the last 10, 15, 20 years, in your lifetime already. From the day you were born to today, as you're sitting here, there have been really remarkable advances in our understanding of the brain. I've witnessed it, right? So my adult life roughly corresponds with your entire life. And when I was your age, the understanding that we had was really rudimentary. So all of these higher order functions of the brain that we have. So for example, memories, associative memories, sleep, cognition, thinking abstractly, emotion, sensation, and the ability to process and have complex motor control, language, behavior. All of these are pretty high order functions of the brain that require many parts of the brain simultaneously. So different regions in the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, which are part of the brainstem or the midbrain, and the brainstem and the cerebellum. All right, so one of the take-homes here, I should put Patanjali on this slide, is that the various functions of the brain, you could point to a spot on the brain and say, what does this thing do? It can do a lot of things. It may be able to do a lot of things. So the functions of the brain don't have easily defined anatomical boundaries. Really what it is patterns of firing across various distributed networks. All right, it's patterns of firing that give rise to different functions in the brain. It used to be like when I was your age, they thought, oh yeah, this part of the brain does this and that and the other thing, and they would have these hyper detailed maps of the brain. That is not the way the brain works, right? This tiny little bit of brain here helps you multiply numbers in that's not exactly right. There is some truth to that, for sure. So, for example, there's somatotopic mapping, which we won't get into too much, but for example, your complete tactile sensorium, so like all the sensory nerves in your body, are mapped in a rough depiction of a human being that is you, that's like mapped right onto the side of the brain on the surface. But a lot of the higher order functions involve these really large networks. So take home, brain function is distributed. One brain region may have many functions. So here's just one example of this. We haven't talked about a lot of parts of the brain yet. We've talked about a few. We talked about the insula, didn't we? Insula is responsible for conscious awareness. Here is, this is a map of all of the regions that have high connectivity with the insula. So these are, the red are places in the cerebrum that are highly connected to the insula. And this polar plot that you see here has all these different functions. So here's like sadness, or I don't know what Tarok is, but happiness, fear, disgust, anxiety, anger, Tom. I guess I have my own spot on there. Right. All these things. Those are a measure of how much firing activity that the insula is involved in when that kind of cognitive process is going on. Okay. Your insula spikes when you think of it. Hopefully that's good. And the point of this slide is that you can't infer cognitive experience from a brain activity. Just because this part of the brain is firing up without understanding the broader pattern of brain firing, you can't actually infer what's going on in the brain a lot of times, depending on the part of it. All right, so let's see an example of this. So here, we got a person. We're going to stick him in the MRI scanner, the brain scanner, this big machine, and tell them, okay, 6 times 4, 24.
Oh, I thought
7 times 5. Well, he was looking at the slide. Doesn't matter. 35. Thank you. And you're doing this, and this part of your brain lights up in the functional MRI scanner, in the brain scanner. So you can infer that when you are multiplying numbers, this part of the brain is involved. Okay, that seems like a reasonable inference. However, the reverse inference is not valid. So you can have somebody in the brain scanner doing some other thing. Maybe they are like, ooh, Johnny and Jackie would make a great pair. Have beautiful kids or something, like you're matchmaking. You're like, I don't know if that's analogous to multiplying or not, but they're doing some other thing in their brain, right? And that part of the brain, without the scientist knowing what's going on in this guy's brain, you don't actually know. You're just like, it's what they're reporting. They're supposed to be multiplying numbers. Instead, they're matchmaking. But this part of the brain is lighting up for some reason. So the inference that the scientist might make, oh, this person is multiplying numbers, that's incorrect. It's incorrect. Okay? Does that make sense? Reverse inference doesn't work. So the brain is highly interconnected. Right here in the corner here, this is just like a pretty picture. But the one in the corner is something I lifted from an article. It's a cerebral interconnectivity map, and I've taken the labels off because there's no point. We're not going to go through all the labels, but each of these nodes represents a region, a neuroanatomical region in the brain, and the black lines show where that region of the brain is connected, highly connected to other parts of the brain. So the brain itself is this massive, highly interconnected network. So the last was a pretty picture that didn't have much meaning in the middle, but this is a pretty picture that actually does. This is hard data. So there is a method of MRI called diffusion tensor imaging that tracks the motion of fluid along fiber pathways in the brain, and it's able to map neuronal interconnectivity. So what you're looking at here is a map of literally millions of neuronal axons that are traveling from one part of the brain to another part of the brain that has been mapped out. This is a total fiber map, cerebral fiber map of the brain. Pretty cool technology for figuring this stuff out. So let's zoom in just a little bit. More pretty pictures. I was having too much fun on Google Image here. And let's actually think about a little bit about how neurons function and how these neural networks, how does neural connectivity work? All right, and once we establish how it works, then we'll see the effects that meditation has on it. All right, so let's get a sense of what it is. So here's my cartoon. This is a neuron with the axon and the synaptic knob. These are the little synaptic vesicles that hold the neurotransmitter. You guys remember back to like the second or third week of class where we kind of went through this a little bit. We didn't go through it, but and then this would be like a dendrite, a downstream neuron. And these are some chemically gated ion channels. Here, these yellow little dots are neurotransmitters. They're going to attach to one of these channels, as you see here, and that channel is going to open and allow various ions to flood into the cell, and it's going to cause an electrical current to happen in the cell. We're not going to get into the details of all of that because it's more than we need for this class. But there's going to be an electrical event that's triggered by these neurotransmitters. This gets passed down the chain. So we have this neuron, it synapses onto these neurons, and this fires, and it sets off this network of firing. The network patterning can be exquisitely complex. I'm just showing it as this like tree, but it is significantly more, it can be significantly more complex than just that, right? There's excitation, there's inhibition, there's feedback, there's collaterals, there's all kinds of patterning, which again is beyond what we need to talk about. What I do want to talk about is long-term potentiation, how we build a network. How does a network change? How does connection between two parts of the brain change? And then how does stress or meditation, the mitigation of stress, affect that? So here is our synapse, all right? And here are the ion channels in the synapse, okay? And this is just that neuron that fires every so often, okay, for whatever. And this is the electrical potential. This is, you can imagine this as like electrical signal intensity with time after a stimulation, all right? So there's an action potential. This downstream neuron gets activated, and we get a little spike in electrical activity. Let's compare that to the electrical activity that you can monitor in a neuron after that neuron has been repeatedly fired. So we fired the upstream neuron again and again and again and again. Right? All this repeat firing has caused an overexpression, an upregulation of these chemically gated ion channels in this postsynaptic membrane. All right? So now this membrane is much more sensitive to these neurotransmitters. This synapse has been stabilized because it's been identified as being an important one that fires a lot. This is something that's important. We use it a lot. Use it or lose it. And so there's significantly more current that gets created here. And we see that in terms of the elevated electrical potential in the postsynaptic membrane. You guys with me? That's right. Yep. So we fire that neuron and we potentiate that. So I'll say it like this. There's increased potential in the downstream neuron when you're firing that neuron a lot. And there's a lot of genetic machinery that goes behind that we're not going to talk about. But yeah, Jensen. Hi.
So are there like physically ion channels?
Yeah. Definitely. All right. So there's that. Let's jump to another thing, another aspect, a little piece in the puzzle, is simply that the brain is trying to be energy efficient. So the brain itself is only 2% of the volume in your body. If you can imagine the total volume of your body, you could fit 50 brains in there if you were nothing but brains. Yeah, it's hard to imagine. But it's about 2% of your body. But it is an energy hog. It takes 20% of the energy. It's like my daughter. She's so tiny and small, but she takes like one of her showers is like a month of mine somehow. She's like, we'll sit in there. So it takes 20% of the energy needs. Even this is an improvement on what it could be. The brain tries hard to be energy efficient. Tries really hard to be energy efficient. And the take home of this concept is that we're leading towards a use it or lose it kind of thing in the brain, right? Use it or lose it. Like these brain pathways, these neurons that get made in the brain, in the juvenile brain, with time, they get pruned out if they're not used, right? The brain is plastic. It responds to usage. Things that aren't being used, those synapses are going to go away. So let's see a picture of that. Here's a dendrite, all right, downstream dendrite. Here are a bunch of different synaptic knobs that are coming into synapse on that. They all have about the same expression pattern of receptors. But this is some neuron that we're not using. Whatever this gets stimulated by, we're not doing it. But we are doing this thing over here. And in fact, not only are we just doing this and this, but we are doing them together. Right? There's a couple different scenarios, right? We do this or we do that, but not this. Well, I'm giving you the scenario where they're doing it together, so I don't have to show 8 slides. And what happens is stabilization. The downstream neuron stabilizes those synapses. They're important. Let's put some receptors in there. We're getting like electrical stimulation, graded potentials are coming off of these synapses. Let's stick some receptors in there to pick up that signal because it's clearly an important thing. This one is still dark, right? So we're not going to stabilize this synapse. We're not going to burn the energy to make all these proteins and stick them in there if it's not something that's getting used, right? And so with time, we're going to eliminate this inactive neuron. That synapse is just going to go away. It gets pruned. It's called neural pruning. That may be just a deletion of that synapse, and so this synaptic baton goes away. it may be deletion of the entire neuron. Maybe that neuron isn't firing at all, right? Maybe the whole neuron goes away. Yeah, anyone? Hi. Okay. No. This is how your brain like conserves energy, right? So we're doing two things here. We're showing how using it reinforces it, all right? And I'm also showing how not using it prunes it. This is how your brain becomes more efficient. So you reach sort of peak neuronal density at the age of like 15 or something like that. And then it starts to go down, right? Right after the onset of puberty. When you get to puberty, some like stuff starts going on in there, man. Some stuff starts going on, and we go through neural pruning. And you guys are going through it right now. You're learning what parts of your brain, what neural pathways, what of the neural tools that you were born with, that you have developed over the last 18 years of your life, which of those tools are you going to keep, and which of them do you not need, right? I mean, you have, all of you have the potential for like rage, flying off the handle or something like that. But if that's not something, hopefully, that you do all the time, those synaptic pathways that are disused get pruned. Yes, ma'am.
Sometimes we also, like, let's say we don't math, like ever in school, pathway lost also.
Well, I have some good news to tell you that you can reinforce pathways, right? So there are a lot of redundant pathways. This is not like a single neuron is like, you know, the pivot point for you to be able to multiply 4 times 9 or something like that, right? There are like parallel, multiple redundant pathways. It's highly interconnected. So if you begin to use pathways that are associated with certain neurocognitive functions, and you use that more and more, with time, you can strengthen that. And that is the bottom line from what I'm going to talk about with meditation here, right? You meditate, those meditative pathways that lead to interconnection in the brain, they get reinforced. I mean, that's the story. All right, so this guy, Donald O. Hebb was his name. He said he came up with the concept of neuroplasticity. He's the first person that really realized that the brain is a kind of a plastic thing. It can be changed. So Molly was worried. Oh my God, I haven't done math yet, but I'm 18. I'm sliding down this cerebral hill. I never really learned my times table. I'm sure she did.
No, that part.
What's going to happen to me? Well, Donald Hebb is here to tell you you'll be fine. You just put your mind to it, and you'll get it. Yeah, learn the times table. Yeah. So the long-winded pronouncement here is any two cell systems or systems of cells that are repeatedly active at the same time will tend to become associated so that activity in one facilitates activity in the other. And all the people in the room were falling asleep. And so he tried to come up with something better. And he said, neurons that fire together, wire together. Oh, soundbite, perfect. Yeah, neurons that fire together, wire together. There are 85 billion neurons in the human brain. That's a lot. 85 billion neurons, give or take. That's a huge number. So the potential for synchronous wiring and interconnectivity is astronomical. Yeah, if you know those like string sculptures where people nail nails on a board and they'll like string them around. There are a lot more pieces of string crossing, potential pieces of string crossing that than there are nodes, right? There's a lot more ways you can interconnect a network than there are nodes in the network. So if there are 85 billion neurons, the number of potential connections is really astronomical. It's like the most sophisticated string art ever going on in your brain. This guy had. I'm just going to do this because why not? He's here. I got to tell you about him. He's weird. He was at McGill, and he actually did have some correlation with meditation. He was at McGill, which is up in Toronto, and he was hired by the CIA, Central Investigation Association. Thank you. That's it. Yeah, you guys were like association. Yes. I don't know. Don't come for me. Stay away from me. This is scary to me. I don't know. Okay, so he was the first. The observation was that the Russian and Chinese governments of the late 40s and 50s, early 50s, were extracting some super far out stuff out of their captives by using these, like, basically torture, isolation, sensory deprivation, torture, like melting their brains with that, and then extracting what they needed from them. So the West, right, the good guys, decided to try to get into the game and understand how this was going. So this guy Hebbs did these sensory deprivation, the first sensory deprivation experiments, at least in the West. So it was all voluntary, but he had all these college students. College students? What? Graduate college students. They were just a little bit older, but still naive. It was all voluntary. They could walk away at any point. But they like wrapped them up in this whole thing, like put these arm things on so they couldn't feel anything. They were just like stuck. There's other, even more psychedelic, would wrap their heads up completely with little tubes that they could breathe out of, and then would like float them in water and stuff.
Oh my God.
This turned out to be freaking crazy for those people. They all survived. Nobody really got past 3 days. They couldn't handle more than 3 days of this. Yeah, what's up?
I just looked it up and it said that
3 days
he
straight.
was like one of the people that like.
Yeah, that's right. That's it. Yep, that's right. So without stimulation, your brain, listen, the use it or lose it thing, right? Your brain just starts. I guess I don't need my memories anymore. So yeah,
Wait, they did it for 3 days straight.
2 to 3 days, and they start to walk away.
Can't they still think?
I don't know. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. Yeah.
Like I'd be like super stressed. I never had that situation that
Let's
my
hook
like
this
brain
up to the
was so
EMG.
crazy.
Seeing this
Like
like
in a
good
good
like
Stranger
with
Things
stuff.
stuff.
Yeah.
Like in
Like
that
after
episode.
a certain time.
No, but it's like the like in this case it was like you could like lose like memories and like stuff, but like potentially can this kind of advance the brain think of like that you would.
Thank you for saving me. Yeah, well, absolutely. There are some, kind of woo-woo yoga studios out in LA that, or wherever, that this is their business. You can go and do some like deep guided meditative stuff in these sensory deprivation baths. I actually have a very good friend who goes by the name of Twig. Who lives in New York or maybe he's in Baltimore now. I don't know, but he runs one of these places. He's into, you can go and pay him some money and float in a tank, and he'll walk you through some meditative experience. So yeah, absolutely, there are certainly dark sides and upsides to sensory deprivation. This was a deep tangent, though. I just wanted to point out that Donald Head was a strange guy. Yeah.
Wait, okay. Wouldn't this like also
Yeah, probably. Sure. Yeah, sensory. I mean, you're just like breaking down, the neurocognitive correlates of the ego here. So of course you're gonna be susceptible to all kinds of stuff. All right, so let's get back to connectivity, and how experience is affecting the plasticity of the brain. So here's a study, an interesting one, about taxi drivers. They have shown that taxi drivers have larger hippocampi than control, than you or me. And if you will throw your mind back and engage your hippocampus, you will remember that hippocampus helps you remember. It's a part of the brain for spatial. You don't remember that?
It just really is remembering itself.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things
Yeah, I know. Isn't that fun?
going on.
Made you do that, a little woo, little rainbow pinwheel in the brain. So here we see it, like taxi drivers, larger hippocampus thing. It's a little bit. And I don't have the data slide on here, but it turns out that it's just in taxi cab drivers, not in bus drivers. Bus drivers are driving the same route every time, so they don't have unique experiences. Whereas a taxi cab driver is always having a unique experience, and they have to have a more complex memory pattern of the spatial mapping. Requires a larger hippocampus. Yes, ma'am. Smartphones.
Yeah, smartphones. Like that literally like in New York, cab drivers you didn't used to have, but now they all.
Sure, probably. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that. I don't have the reference down there. You could find it, I'm sure.
I feel like you had to go drive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, so the thing here is use it or lose it, right? So we're doing something with our brains, and whatever we're doing with our brains, that thing that we're using in the brain is getting reinforced. I would like to suggest to you that doing a little bit of meditation might be a good way to exercise part of your brain that will make you a healthier person. Yes?
There's often, like, at least maybe that's, but when I was middle school, and they would often a bunch of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
like just continuously, and I feel like memorization of, I mean, like obviously times like that, like, and like as time has gone on, the essay have the section,
Yeah.
and so like, is that going to be a skill that?
Well, look, unless memory obsolete or evolutionarily pruned. What do you mean? Like obsolete? I don't know. Maybe. Are humans going to lose the capacity for memorization? No, I don't think so, because it's I don't know. Unless there, maybe in the long term, but unless there's a selective pressure against it. Like, let's be real. The way that a trait evolves is whatever that trait is, it enables you to survive long enough to have the best mate that is going to give you the most offspring, right? I mean, that's how it actually works. So, yeah, it seems like being able to memorize something, there's not going to be a either positive or negative correlation with fecundity, as it were, on that trait. Let's see what else we can get to before the end here. So here's another similar study. I have a number of these, right? So this study showed that there is an experience-related change in gray matter volume and connectivity in professional musicians over amateurs or non-musicians, and specifically in these parts of the brain here. All right. Yeah, in the superior parietal lobe, important part of the prefrontal cortex, and in the a section of the temporal lobe. So these people who are focusing their attention see an increase in these correlated regions of the brain, and we're going to find out that this that this part of the brain has a functional significance these parts of the brain have a functional significance that will be revealed not this time, but next. Oh yeah, and then jugglers. Can't not talk about jugglers. So here's another example. This is the percent change in brain matter before the scan, after 3 months of practice juggling flaming chainsaws. No, I don't think it was flaming chainsaws, just balls. Yeah, and then they stopped, and then they looked at what happened without that area. It's this part of the brain here that is associated with motor control, sensory, hand-eye coordination, and maybe a little bit of judgment region of the brain. It's really why you juggle. But after 3 months, it kind of shrinks back down a little bit.
Wait, hold on. Was this amateur? Like, was he like a
No, this is like a Google image search for juggling GIF that had nothing to do with. I just wanted a picture of a juggler there, and that was.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, yeah, he's doing it.
My friend's dad.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
I was like
one.
dangerous
I know
and
how to
nice.
jump.
Yeah, I'm gonna be a pyromaniac.
All right.
I'm sure.
So I've got 45 seconds. The last slide I'm going to show here just shows the change. So I've shown you that overall volume of brain matter declines with age, right? But I'm going to show you here that it's a little bit more nuanced than that. That in fact, white matter goes up, whereas gray matter goes down. And these are on different scales, mind you, a much larger scale here. So as a whole, volume goes down with age, but your white matter goes up and gray matter goes down. So what's the significance? What's the significance of white matter? What is white matter? What does that represent? What is the white matter? It's the axons and represents connectivity, right? So that's like sending the signal somewhere. It's connectivity. Brain connectivity goes up, but amount of gray matter goes down with age. All right? And gray matter goes down more than white matter goes up. But okay, we're going to leave it there, and I'll pick up next time with that.